Could you imagine preserving food for years of long sea voyages without refrigerators or access to cheap salt? Vikings set sail on voyages lasting months, stormed coastlines and founded colonies, and all the while their armies had to be fed. Their strength lay not only in the steel of their swords, but also in the technologies that allowed them to take tons of food with them. But what if the main secret of their pantries was not salt at all, but something much more ancient and powerful? Wind, acid, and smoke. Watch this video to the end to find out which Viking preservation method was so extreme that it required burying food in the ground for several months, and why they did it. What if I told you that everything you believed about Vikings and salt is not true? We are used to thinking of medieval preservation as barrels filled to the brim with salt, but in Scandinavia in the 8th to 11th centuries, salt was a luxury. It was valued as highly as silver and was not available to everyone. It was extracted by evaporating seawater, which was a long and laborious process. Therefore, it was impossible to build an entire food security system on an expensive imported commodity. The northern peoples took a different path, perfecting the methods they had inherited from their ancestors. They learned to use the elements that surrounded them: icy winds, sour dairy products, and acrid smoke from fires. These technologies were cheap, reliable, and allowed food to be stored on an industrial scale. The Vikings did not just survive, they created a system that fueled their expansion. Instead of relying on a single preservative, they developed a whole arsenal of approaches. Each method was suited to its own type of product and season. It was a complex, multi-layered strategy, where each element complemented the other. They did not depend on a single resource, which made their system incredibly resilient.
We use the salt to draw out the moisture. This is the only way it survives the winter.
How long must the fish hang in the smoke?
This ingenuity is the real key to understanding their world. It manifested itself not only in the construction of drakkars or the forging of swords, but also in such a seemingly mundane task as food storage. The ability to preserve the catch or prey meant the ability to survive the winter and equip a ship for a voyage. It was a strategic art on which everything depended. In this video, we will not talk about banal salting. We will immerse ourselves in the world of real, almost forgotten technologies of the northern peoples. We will learn how air can turn fish into stone and sour milk can replace brine. This story is not about salt, but about the ingenuity of an entire era. They used what they had in abundance. They had a cold, dry climate, ideal for one of the most ancient methods. They had a developed dairy industry that produced sour byproducts, and they had an endless supply of wood for smoke.
These fish, dried in the wind, will last through the winter, and the sour milk in these jars will keep us strong when the hunts are lean.
We would love to hear your opinion. What other myths about the Vikings that we consider to be true are actually misconceptions? Write about it in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on other historical investigations.
We crossed the great sea not with swords, but with courage born of the old gods. Remember this when the winter winds blow cold.
Are you ready to learn the truth about how the Vikings built real skyscrapers out of food using only the wind? One of the main and most extensive preservation methods was open-air drying. In the cold and dry conditions of the Scandinavian climate, this process was incredibly effective. The Vikings brought it to the level of true industrial production, which fed them all year round. The central element of this technology was special wooden structures known as yell. These were huge frames or racks assembled from poles, which were installed in places exposed to all winds. Most often, they were built on the rocky shores of fjords, where a constant flow of cold air did all the work.
These look ready for the Bergen merchants.
Aye, the wind has been good to them this week.
Fish, most often cod caught during the winter fishing season, were hung on these frames. The fish were gutted and tied in pairs by their tails, thrown over the poles. Thousands and thousands of fish carcasses hung on these cathedrals, slowly losing moisture under the influence of the sun and wind. It is important to note that the process took place at a low temperature, close to zero, which prevented the product from spoiling before it dried. This method required no salt, no fire, and no complicated equipment. Only knowledge of the climate and the right choice of location. Wind and cold were the main preservatives. After a few months, the fish lost up to 80% of its moisture, turning into what we know today as stockfish or torfisk. The finished product was as hard as wood and weighed almost nothing. It could be stored for years, did not spoil, and was ideal provisions for sea voyages. It was light, compact, and incredibly nutritious. Before consumption, such fish was beaten for a long time and soaked in water to restore its softness. The Vikings dried meat in the same way. Thin strips were cut and hung on the same frames or simply in the shade under awnings. Dried meat, or skarpikjøt, could also be stored for a very long time. It was a strategic reserve in case of war, crop failure, or a long winter. The scale of this production was astonishing. Archaeological finds and sagas describe entire factories for the production of dried fish. It was not just a way to feed themselves, but also an important export commodity. The Vikings traded their dried fish throughout Europe, exchanging it for grain, fabrics, and metals.
Your grain sack is light. 10 barrels for the silk and the grain.
The silk is finest quality. 11 barrels, and we have a deal.
How edible do you think this product was after several years of storage? But drying in the wind was only effective in dry and cold weather. Ready to find out what shocking method they used in wet and warm conditions, and what dairy products have to do with it? I'm going to reveal the most closely guarded secret of the Viking pantry, and it's sure to surprise you. What do you do when the climate is too humid for drying and there is no salt? The Vikings found an ingenious answer in the byproducts of their dairy farming. They mastered the art of acid preservation using what we would simply pour away today: whey.
This is how we have always done it. You must watch the smoke and ensure the seal on the barrels holds tight through the winter.
The Scandinavians were skilled at raising livestock. They produced a lot of milk, from which they made cheese, butter, and the famous skyr, a thick fermented milk product. After making cheese and skyr, a huge amount of liquid remained. Whey, or misa. This liquid was very sour due to lactic acid bacteria. The Vikings noticed that this acidic environment suppressed the growth of putrefactive bacteria. Lactobacilli created an environment in which other harmful microorganisms simply could not survive. This discovery was as significant as the invention of gunpowder in another era. They learned to use good bacteria to fight bad bacteria.
These vessels held up well through the winter.
Yes, but we will need more before the next shipment.
From the milk comes this gift. The fermentation process honors the gods and strengthens the body. We must never waste a drop of the whey.
The process was simple but effective. Meat or fish was cut into pieces, sometimes pre-boiled, and then tightly packed into wooden barrels. After that, the contents of the barrel were completely filled with this acidic whey. The barrels were hermetically sealed and stored in a cellar or simply buried in the ground to maintain a cool temperature. In this sour bath, food could be stored for months without spoiling. The meat acquired a specific sour taste and became very tender. This method was called sur in Iceland. Almost everything was preserved this way, from meat to offal.
To the harvest! May the gods favor us with full bellies and strong arms!
Drink well!
It was the ideal way to preserve food in humid summers or mild autumns. It required no fire, no cold, and no expensive ingredients. Just a barrel and a byproduct of dairy production, which was always in abundance. It was a closed, waste-free system. This method of preservation not only preserved protein, but also, in essence, pre-digested it. The acid broke down tough fibers, making even the oldest and toughest meat edible. For people with coarse food, this was an added benefit.
The sour brine penetrates the fibers, making the meat tender and ensuring it lasts until spring.
This method required great care. It was important to ensure complete air tightness and correct acidity. Otherwise, the contents of the barrel could spoil. But over centuries of practice, the Vikings perfected this technology.
The seal must be perfect, lads, or the winter stores will spoil. See how the pitch fills the gap. Now set the bung.
Acid barrels were as important a part of their daily life as swords or axes. They provided stability in a world where hunger was a constant threat. If you think this method is ingenious, be sure to like this video.
Remember, lads, this isn't just common acid. It is the key to forging the strongest steel in the north. Guard it with your lives.
Guess which technology the Vikings perfected, and which we use every time we cook outdoors. When drying in the wind was impossible due to humidity, and there were not enough fermented milk products, the third element came into play: fire. More precisely, its derivative, smoke. Smoking was one of the most reliable ways not only to preserve food, but also to give it a unique flavor.
Try some, brother. Never had better.
The Vikings practiced two main types of smoking: cold and hot. Hot smoking was, in essence, cooking. The product was placed close to the fire and baked while being saturated with smoke. Such food had to be eaten fairly quickly. It was not intended for long-term storage.
I told him the fjord was frozen.
Cold smoking was the true art of preservation. This process was long and laborious. The products were placed in a special smokehouse or simply in a closed room, away from the source of the fire. The fire smoldered somewhere off to the side or in a pit, and only thick, cool smoke entered the smokehouse. This smoke, which had a temperature of no more than 25 to 30 degrees, slowly enveloped the products. The process could last several days or even weeks. During this time, the smoke not only drew out moisture, but also saturated the meat and fish with special substances, phenols and aldehydes contained in wood. These substances had powerful bactericidal properties. They created a protective film on the surface of the product that prevented bacteria from developing. In addition, the product itself became denser, lost water, and acquired a characteristic golden brown color and deep aroma. Specific types of wood were used for smoking, as they produced the right smoke. Most often, these were alder, juniper, or beech. Each tree imparted its own unique flavor. The Vikings were true gourmets in this regard, knowing exactly which wood was best suited for fish and which for meat. Smokehouses were often simple structures, pits covered with branches or small wooden sheds without windows. The main thing was to ensure a constant flow of thick smoke and prevent open flames. This required constant monitoring day and night. Smoked meat and fish could be stored for months. They could be taken on long sea voyages without fear of spoilage. Unlike dried stock fish, smoked products did not require such lengthy preparation before consumption, although they were often boiled anyway.
Try the fish, my love.
It looks delicious. Thank the gods for this meal.
Which of the smoked foods we eat today do you think most closely resembles those ancient methods? But what if I told you that the Vikings did not dry or smoke their most valuable foods, but entrusted them to the earth itself? In the next chapter, we will discuss the strangest method of preservation, storage in swamps and permafrost. Not all foods could be effectively dried or smoked, especially fatty foods such as butter. For this, the Vikings had a different, completely non-trivial approach. They used the earth as a giant natural preservative. It was a technology based on two factors: cold and the absence of oxygen. In northern latitudes, the ground froze deeply or did not thaw completely in some places. The Vikings dug deep cellars or pits, using the permafrost as a natural freezer. In such storage facilities, meat, fish, and butter could lie for months, remaining fresh, just like in a modern refrigerator. This method required no expense other than the physical labor of creating the cellar. It was an ideal system for long-term storage of farm supplies. Archaeologists find the remains of such cellars, which were an integral part of any large Viking settlement.
This crossbeam is almost entirely intact.
Yes, I've logged the coordinates. The preservation here is unlike anything we've seen.
Look at the carving here. It matches the pattern on the Oseberg ship.
Incredible. We need to document this immediately.
But even more surprising was the use of peat bogs. The bogs were not just dangerous swamps, they were giant canning jars. Peat moss, sphagnum, creates a unique environment. Very acidic, cold, and most importantly, oxygen-free. In such anaerobic conditions, putrefactive bacteria simply cannot exist.
The bog holds many secrets and many dangers. Step carefully, for the earth here hungers.
The Vikings, like other peoples of northern Europe, lowered wooden barrels filled with oil into the bogs. Protected by the wood and surrounded by the acidic environment of the peat, the oil could be stored not just for years, but for decades. This product is known to historians as bog oil. When such barrels are found today, the oil inside is often still recognizable, although it acquires a specific, pungent taste and a texture similar to wax. For the Vikings, this was a reliable way to preserve a valuable source of fat in case of a hungry winter or war. The same principle was probably used for meat. Pieces of meat wrapped in skins or placed in containers could also be lowered into peat bogs. The acidic environment and lack of oxygen mummified the product, making it inedible to bacteria but suitable for humans after processing. Today, it is difficult for us to imagine burying food in a bog and considering it a reliable method of storage. But in a world without artificial refrigeration and industrial preservatives, it was an ingenious engineering solution. It demonstrates how closely the Vikings were connected to their land. Are you ready for the shocking truth about what the Vikings ate when there was no other food available? There was a method that today seems to us to be one of the most extreme culinary practices in the world. We are talking about fermentation taken to the extreme, and the most striking example of this is the famous Icelandic hakal. This method was applied to Greenland shark meat. The problem was that this shark meat is poisonous when fresh. It contains huge amounts of urea and trimethylamine oxide, which makes it unfit for consumption. But the Vikings couldn't afford to throw away tons of valuable protein.
Gods are testing us with this foul meat. How do we keep it?
We smoke it longer, let the fire cleanse the poison.
They developed a complex, months-long detoxification process. First, the shark carcass was gutted and cut into large pieces. These pieces were then placed in pits dug in the gravel or sand on the ocean shore. The pits were covered and weighed down with heavy stones. Under this pressure, the meat was left to ferment for several months, usually 6 weeks to 3 months. During this time, the toxic liquids under the pressure of the stones flowed out of the meat and were absorbed into the ground. Complex biochemical processes took place inside the pieces. After that, the ripened meat was taken out of the pits. It was no longer poisonous, but it had acquired an incredibly pungent, specific smell of ammonia. However, the process did not end there. This was only the first stage of preservation. Then the pieces of shark meat were hung on the same wooden yelas that we mentioned earlier. There they hung for several more months, slowly drying in the cold wind. The wind carried away the remains of the ammonia smell and turned the fermented flesh into a solid product ready for storage. The result was something that had little in common with fresh fish. It was a product with a unique, acquired taste that could be stored for a very long time. It was pure, concentrated protein that saved more than one generation of Icelanders from starvation.
We lost 3 good men to the ice before we found the cave. Without this dried venison, none of us would have seen spring.
Would you dare to try such a dish, knowing how it was prepared? They prepared all this food, but how did they store it in their homes and on their ships so that it would not get wet and spoil? In the next chapter, we will take a look inside the Vikings' pantries. Creating a food supply was only half the battle. It was no less difficult to keep it intact in a damp climate, in wooden houses, and even more so on board a ship sailing through the salty spray of the Atlantic. Storage logistics was as much an art as preservation itself. On land, storage was based on special structures. In wealthy estates, this was the stabber, a barn raised above the ground on pillars. This design solved several problems at once. Raising it above the ground protected supplies from soil moisture and meltwater. The posts on which the barn stood were often made smooth or encircled with metal sheets. This was necessary to protect against rodents, which could not climb such a surface. In this way, the Vikings ensured the inviolability of their supplies of grain, dried meat, and fish. Cellars and underground storage areas were actively used inside dwellings. They maintained a consistently low temperature, ideal for storing barrels of fermented products, sour milk preparations, and beer. The cellar was the heart of the home, its strategic reserve. Products that needed to stay dry, like dried fish, stockfish, or smoked meat, were stored hanging up. They were tied into bundles and hung under the roof of the barn or in the attic, where there was a breeze to keep them from getting damp. Only the most reliable and compact supplies were taken on board a drakkar. The main containers were wooden barrels. The Vikings were unsurpassed coopers. Their barrels were strong, airtight, and able to withstand any rocking. We have already mentioned that whey, a byproduct of milk production, was important for preservation. But the main products, milk and butter, were themselves valuable resources that also needed to be preserved. Fresh milk does not keep for long, so the Vikings turned it into white gold, cheese and butter.
This bread is good. Try the butter Ivar made.
It is very rich. The cheese is excellent too.
We will eat well tonight.
Butter production was one of the most important activities on any farm. Cream was churned into butter, which was the main source of fat in the diet. But butter quickly goes rancid when exposed to air. The Vikings used several methods to preserve it. If salt was available, the butter was salted. Heavy salted butter could be stored in barrels for quite a long time, but as we remember, salt was expensive. Therefore, butter was more often stored in bogs, as we have already mentioned. Bog butter was a reliable strategic reserve. Another method was rendering. The butter was slowly heated, separating the pure fat from the water and milk impurities. The resulting clarified butter was much more resistant to spoilage and could be stored in pots in a cool cellar. But the main method of preserving milk was cheese making. The Vikings made many types of cheese. These included hard cheeses that could mature for months, becoming only better. A hard cheese head covered with a rind was an ideal camping product, high in calories and long-lasting. Skyr was of great importance. Technically, it is not exactly cheese, but a thick fermented milk product similar to yogurt. Thanks to the high acidity created by lactic acid bacteria, skyr could be stored in cool cellars for weeks or even months. It was not just a product, it was a living preservative. Skyr was the basis of many dishes. It was eaten fresh, mixed with berries, and also used as a basis for preserving other products. It was a universal source of protein. The process of making cheese and skyr also produced the very same whey miso that was used to preserve meat. Thus, Viking dairy farming was completely waste-free. It provided fats, proteins, and a preservative. So what ended up in the hold of a drakkar setting off on a long voyage to the shores of England or Iceland? The Vikings' diet on board was a direct reflection of all the preservation methods we have discussed. It was a carefully selected, high-calorie, and maximally compact menu. The basis of the diet was undoubtedly stockfisk, wind-dried cod. It was light, took up little space, and was practically eternal. For warriors who expended enormous energy rowing, this pure protein was indispensable. The second most important product was dried meat, skarpikjot, or its smoked counterparts. It was also light and nutritious. It could be eaten dry, like jerky, or soaked and cooked in soup. Large barrels were used to store meat preserved in sour whey. This sur was a source of not only protein, but also fat. It was ready to eat right away, although its sharp taste took some getting used to. Of course, cheese was taken on board. Large heads of hard cheese were the perfect camping food. They could be easily divided into portions, did not spoil, and provided a lot of energy. Butter, salted or melted, was also taken in barrels to be added to porridge. Carbohydrates were represented in the form of crackers or flatbread made from rye or barley flour. This was the Vikings' bread. They also carried dried peas and beans in sacks, which could be boiled in a cauldron if the weather permitted. Don't forget about drinks. Water was stored in barrels, but it spoiled quickly. Therefore, the main drink on board was beer or ale. It was a weak but nutritious drink. Thanks to hops and alcohol, it lasted longer than water and was safer. All these provisions were stored below deck or in special lockers. Each warrior most likely had his own personal supply, but there was also a common cauldron, which was heated on a special stone plate on the deck when the sea was calm. The combination of these foods provided the warriors with everything they needed: protein, fat, and carbohydrates. It was not the most refined diet, but it was effective. It was this meticulously planned logistics that allowed the Vikings to make their incredible voyages across the ocean. Their ships were self-sufficient fortresses, capable of existing for weeks on the open sea.
Pass the lines!
Aye, steady on the tiller.
That price is too high for this cut.
It is the finest smoked boar in the fjord. I will not go lower.
How much for the dried cod?
Centuries have passed, and the Viking era has long since become a thing of the past. But what is striking is that their preservation methods have not disappeared. They have not only survived, but have become the basis of national identity and culinary pride in the Scandinavian countries. What was born out of harsh necessity has now become a delicacy. The famous stockfish from Norway is still produced using the same technology as 1,000 years ago. The fish is dried on the same wooden frames in the cold wind of the Lofoten Islands. Today, it is an expensive export product that is appreciated by gourmets in Italy and Portugal. Icelandic hakal, fermented shark, is still a national dish. It is served to tourists as an extreme attraction, but for Icelanders themselves, it is a tribute to their ancestors. who were able to survive in inhuman conditions thanks to this strange product.
And here we have the finest hakal. Be brave now.
Oh, wow, that is strong.
To our ancestors.
Swedish surströmming, fermented herring, is a direct descendant of those very fermented products. Its pungent smell is known throughout the world, but it remains an important part of Swedish culture.
Okay, stand back. Here it comes.
Smoked salmon, meat drying methods, and traditional cheese production are all living legacies of the Viking era. Modern technology has changed the scale, but the essence of the processes remains the same. This shows how profound and effective their system was. It was perfectly attuned to the environment. The Vikings did not try to break it, but integrated themselves into it using wind, cold, bacteria, and smoke. When we eat a piece of dried meat or smoked fish today, we are essentially touching that era. We are tasting the same thing that Ragnar or Leif Erikson ate when they set out on their voyages. We can see that the Viking world was based not only on strength and courage, but also on remarkable ingenuity in the most mundane things. Their ability to preserve food without salt, using only the forces of nature, wind, cold, acid, and smoke, was a real technological breakthrough. This invisible revolution in the Pantry allowed them to change the map of the world. From giant cathedrals for drying fish to the extreme fermentation of poisonous sharks, each method was perfected. They created a system that fed their armies, fueled their trade, and enabled them to survive where it seemed impossible to survive. What other secrets of the Viking Age would you like to uncover? Perhaps you are interested in their shipbuilding, their beliefs, or the mysteries of their runestones. Suggest topics for future videos you would like to see on our channel in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our new research.